My name's Sharon Walters and I'm an artist. I've been creating a body of work called Seeing Ourselves for the past 6 years. They consist predominantly of collages and paper cutout works.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to the National Gallery. This is Unexpected Views, which is our series of talks with leading artists and cultural practitioners of today. In this talk, we focus on one work of art in the collection, and we draw out the connections and the themes, and also talk about the practice of our contemporary artists alongside social and cultural issues. I'd also like to say thank you to Hiscox for supporting the event. I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm Emily Stone, and I'm the project curator here in the Modern and Contemporary team at the National Gallery. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Sharon Walters, who is an incredible artist. She's a London-based artist and project curator, whose series entitled Seeing Ourselves is an exploration of identity, beauty standards and race through intricate paper cutouts and hand-assembled collages. Her works recently featured in group shows at Claridge's Art Space, curated by Echo Eshen, the Gargosian, curated by Peju Oshin, and she's also a mentor on the BBC One programme Make It at Market. Last year, Sharon was commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery to create a work celebrating radical publishers and political and social activists Eric and Jessica Huntley. The work has been acquired by the gallery and will go on display this year in July 2024. Whoop, whoop.
Sorry, I'm still excited about it.
I know, I'm very proud of that work, actually. And at the end of last year, Sharon gained gallery representation from Hacklebury Fine Art, who will present her pieces in a number of international art fairs this year, along with her first solo show in London in May this year, which I think deserves another round of applause.
Trying not to cry at that point. Holding it together.
Save that for the end.
Okay.
So today we're stood in front of Margaret of Antioch, which is a painting by Francisco de Zurbarán, made in 1634 to 35. Mm-hmm. And why are we here, Sharon? Why are we in front of this work?
Well, firstly, I want to thank everyone for coming. There was a little part of me thinking, oh, maybe people won't turn up because it's a free event. I think I was a little bit wrong because there are lots of you here, so thank you for coming. And thank you to Emily for inviting me. The reason why we're here, looking at this piece, is because I was really drawn to it. So if anyone knows my work, if anyone knows my body of work called Seeing Ourselves, it's about looking at representation. It's about looking at images in archives, in collections. It's about taking up space as a black woman of African descent. When I walked around the gallery, I couldn't actually see myself reflected back. And I know this is something that happens very often, and it can be very isolating coming into these spaces if you don't see yourself reflected back. But what I did see in this work was I saw a side eye. And I could really recognize this side eye, mainly because it's a look that my daughter gives. She's 11. And I was just struck by her. She looks defiant. She looks as though she doesn't really give a damn, which I like. Sometimes I like it. But she looked really strong. And what I really hoped for is that initially there was that draw, there's that look, there's that gaze, there's that strong, defiant look. But what I also hoped was that I could see myself reflected back. And maybe that means reinterpreting pieces like this. Maybe that means reenacting works like this. Maybe that means more research. I think I answered that quite well. It's all right.
Yeah, no, I love that answer.
Didn't even prep that.
You know, I've known your work for a few years now, and I worked with you at the Portrait Gallery on commissioning that piece, and I thought of you when I saw this work because you work with portraiture and you work with representations of women, of strong women, and
vulnerable women. It's really important. Sorry to interrupt, but I will. I think there is this trope of being a strong black woman, and I'm pushing against that. I think there's space to be both.
Yeah.
So I think fragility, which we'll talk about later, is also really important. Vulnerability is also really important.
Well, I wanted to hear from you about your interest in portraiture and where did that start?
I think that my interest in portraiture possibly started when I used to do, and I thought of this just as we were preparing, didn't I? But I think it's to do with life drawing classes. So I went to life drawing classes as a child, as a teenager, not as a really young child. And I loved creating artworks that were based on someone who was live in front of me. And so I made these works. But then I went on to make, to document oral histories. So I was interested in people's stories. I also did still life drawing as well. So there were all these ways of creating portraits in sometimes non-conventional ways, but I think that's where it began. I think it's partly about storytelling, but it's also about looking at who's included in traditional portraiture and who's excluded as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the woman in this portrait is St. Margaret.
Yeah.
And we've talked a bit about her story, but for everybody here who might not be familiar, she was the only daughter of a pagan priest. She lost her mother quite young, and she was raised by a Christian nurse who also had sheep and was a shepherdess. So hence the kind of the crook that you see in the portrait. A powerful man. Who was, a ruler of the part of where she lived, called Olibrius, asked her for a hand in marriage, and she declined.
Love that.
Absolutely.
I really love that.
But he denounced her as a Christian, and that led to her being imprisoned, to being tortured. And then the devil appeared to her in the guise of the dragon, the monster.
Did you notice the dragon?
And she allegedly pierced her way out. She was eaten by the dragon. She pierced her way out using the crucifix. And she then became the patron saint of women in childbirth. So this woman, there's a lot that she's representing here. She's not a woman who was a mother herself, but she represents that struggle. And you made a piece of work which I found really interesting and had a lot of similarities for me when I was thinking of the story of St. Margaret, where you are representing yourself as a mother, but yourself as a woman, as a black woman, as a woman with a family. You put yourself...
Shall I show the image?
Please show the image, because I think that helps. I know it really well, and I need to remember that everyone here doesn't.
Yeah. We should, though, to be honest.
You should know this work, exactly.
But here we are.
But this is work that you made where you're holding your young son at the time, and you're pregnant with your daughter. But the figure that really stands out is you.
Yes.
And can you talk a bit about this work?
I can. So this work was a commissioned work by Soho House, which is a global private members club. The theme was the body. And when I thought about the body, I thought about what was the most extreme thing that had happened to me and my body. First of all, I thought of my spinal surgery, and then I was like, don't really want to make a work about spinal surgery. And then I thought about motherhood. It's funny it came up second, oops. And I thought about pregnancy and how extreme it was to go through that and the expectations of you as a mother. But what I really wanted to do with this work was to create a portrait where my children were there and not there. If anyone follows me on social media, London_artist1 on Instagram, if anyone follows me there, they'll know that I don't share images of my children. It's really important to me that I keep them private. There are some things that need, for me, to stay very personal and very safe and very precious. So yeah, this image is of me pregnant with my daughter, who's now 11, and my son there, he's actually now almost 16. So you can see there are two layered images. The person who actually took the photograph was my husband, so it feels as though it's a family portrait. They're there and they're not there, but me being center stage, playing center stage, is really important Possibly because, especially after having children, I felt as though it was so much to do with the children, and there was all this pressure to be this perfect mother and to be this wife and to be this friend, and there were all these things that I was supposed to be. But ultimately what I suffered with was postnatal depression. So I think this work is a really personal work because I'm kind of saying I'm still here, I'm saying I matter, and I got through it. And now I'm standing here almost 16 years later going, and I still am enough, I'm more than enough.
And what did you think when we stood in front of this work and you noticed the dragon, the beast, and you heard about that story and that fight?
I really the more I read about this piece, the more I liked it. At first it was the side eye, I told you it was the side eye. And then the more I read about this piece, I thought, I love how she wasn't going to be swallowed up by the dragon. She fought her way out. She survived. And so I felt really, really strongly that she was strong. But also the way that she's dressed, I love this very chic shepherdess vibe that she's got going on. I should have tried a bit harder. But I really love this look. I love the fact that it doesn't feel as though she's being objectified as a sexual female. There's no kind of, I don't know, it's very, very different to other images of women historically in artworks.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to think about the representations. We talked a bit about this being a work of art made by a man.
Yeah.
Representing a saint.
A virgin saint.
And you're right, it does have a modesty to it. And a lot of Zurbarán's works were commissioned to sit in a series. They were commissioned to sit in religious spaces, in monasteries, in churches. We believe this was made as a standalone work, but I think the context of the work is quite interesting and what that says. And as a religious figure, she has some of those tropes, her fingers in the prayer book, that's a symbol of, her being very pious. But I still think there's this contemporary edge, and I don't know if it's the colours, if it's the patterns, there's something incredibly beautiful about it.
It does feel really contemporary, and I think that's why I was drawn to it as well, because I have to be honest, these spaces, as I said earlier, I don't always feel very attracted to the imagery, to the artwork, but this piece felt really different. And I think there's something to do with, it's something to do with her stance, yes, her gaze, but also something to do with the way the piece is painted. It's an oil painting, but there's a real brightness to her skin. It shines, there's really interesting use of light and shade, but there isn't loads of, like the pieces I create, I really work with light and shade. So when I'm creating paper cutouts, I'm cutting away, I'm removing certain sections, I'm replacing them with other sections. But here, I don't even know where I would start with an image like this.
I mean, that was going to be one of my questions.
I did help you.
Yes, I know. As somebody who does paper cut, what are you drawn to? What are you noticing? Where would you start on a piece?
I know straight away. It would be the bag, and I think it would be the bag because of the patterns. Because at the moment, I'm really, really interested and a little bit obsessed with making very, very fragile paper cutouts. I think it's reminding me of doilies, and it's reminding me of my grandmother who's from the Caribbean. And there's this beauty and this fragility that I really, really love. So that's where I would start. And I'd probably take off my glasses and get really, really close. And I use a scalpel knife and a cutting mat. And I would just be cutting into these sections. So yeah, that's where I'd start.
That's interesting that you'd start there and not the face. Which
because
I would
there's not much to go on.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's interesting as well. There's a lot written about whether Zurbarán was working with real life models. There's some people believe he was working from his daughter, so he had a number of children. And actually, this work here by Juan de Zurbarán is his son. So he was, you know, there's a lot of collaboration happening with his family, and he often worked with his daughters as models. We don't know if that's the case here, because I think this is a bit almost mask-like, you know, there's something that doesn't have that real
lifelike
quality to it. But you've collaborated with your daughter, and I think that's really interesting, as she's so young as well. But what's that relationship like? What's that kind of dynamic?
I really love working with my daughter. I love working with my son as well. So my son is almost 16. That feels weird to say. I don't feel old enough to have a 16-year-old. But anyway, I am.
You don't look old enough.
Thank you, very nice. Nice of you to say that. But I am. But it feels really special. I think a lot of my time is spent either making art, thinking about art, being a little bit obsessed with it. And to bring the family, well, my daughter and my son in to my practice, even if it's not a super regular thing, it feels really, really special. My daughter is really, really talented. She's some of the works I've created, especially her most recent work, she took the photograph, a portrait of me. I can't remember if I have that one. Yeah, I have one, actually. She took a photograph of me, and then I used the image to create another piece. Yeah, please. So there are two here that I've brought. Thank you. So this is the outline that I used to create this piece. I don't even know if it's even finished, but I like playing with it. I liked the profile. Working with her feels interesting because she's very strong-willed and has her own approach to things. But I wanted her to feel confident with using expensive equipment. So I gave her the DSLR camera that, you know, it took me years to get to that point of being able to afford one of those cameras. And I got her to take the photograph. And I honestly feel as though that's the only time that I really feel comfortable with someone taking my photograph, is when it's one of the children that take it. I wish they'd do it more often, but I think I'd have to pay them.
They are your children after all, Sharon. I wanted to talk a bit about symbolism in the work. So we've mentioned already some of the tropes, I suppose, that you were noticing, the kind of the saddlebag, the prayer book, the kind of the dragon, and all these things tell us and give us clues that this is St. Margaret, although I think a lot of people now potentially wouldn't recognize those clues, but they are there. You're working often with real people in your portraits. How important is that symbolism and that layering to you, so that people can read the work, read a story into the work?
I think when I started the series 6 years ago, it was really, really important. So I was using, quite often I was using nature in the work to talk about natural beauty, and I was talking about Afro hair, and so I was using all of these references. As most recently, I've started to strip more and more away, because I'm thinking about how the viewer might interpret things so that I don't give so many clues, that I'm not telling so much of a story. Like so obviously. And so by removing lots of pieces, I'm offering space for imagination, for reimagining possibly as well, and for people to bring their own, you know, the audience to bring their own thoughts, their own feelings to a piece of work.
I'd really love to show the work that we mentioned in the introduction of Eric and Jessica, which I know you've got with you.
I did a lot of printing today.
So I worked with you on this piece at the time for the portrait gallery, and I really wanted to represent Eric and Jessica in the portrait gallery collection as part of the story of the UK, because I think they're so important, and I couldn't find a portrait of them that existed that helped do that work. And you really ran with this in terms of the archival material and the connection. I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about this, because this feels very different actually to other work that you've done.
Yeah, this work, so this feels like possibly the most important piece that I've made in the collection, partly because I actually went to a supplementary school that Eric and Jessica Huntley set up. It was a school that was set up so that young black children were given the same opportunities as young white children, and so when my kids complain now, you know, the daughter doesn't complain that much, but if one of my children complains at any point, I say to him, you know, I actually went to school 6 days a week. But the reason why this is important is because it feels like a full circle kind of moment for me. For people who were able to put so much love, education, encouragement, inspiration into my life as I was growing up, to now be able to create a work that has now been acquired by the National Portrait Gallery and will go on display in July, this feels like the best thing I could possibly give back, because what else could you give? So this is why this is important. For me, it was really important to ensure that I, you know, use these images of both Eric and Jessica, but also talked about the bookshop, which was a really major bookshop at a time where, you know, there weren't many bookshops that showed the work, you know, that sold the work of black authors. But I also had this really beautiful image of Eric's home, but also the children that went to school, to the supplementary school. But I didn't want to shy away from the fact that they experienced adversity and racism. And so it was really important that I included this extract from one of the images, which said, I don't think you can probably see it at the back, but it says, "Keep Britain White." So that's why this piece means a lot. And I really enjoyed working with you on that.
Yeah, and again, it's that level of being able to read into the work. Not everybody will know that story, but I think there's so much that you've given visually, those visual clues to tell us about Eric and Jessica's life over a real duration of time, which no kind of snapshot portrait can do. But I think, you know, your practice lets us tell that story, which is really, really,
thank you,
really lovely. This work is oil on canvas, and the brushstrokes are visible in certain parts of the way. They are smooth. Yeah. Have you experimented with painting?
I have, and I've reintroduced painting back into my practice. So I was commissioned to do a portrait. Well, it wasn't a portrait. I was commissioned to do a piece of work. And the person who commissioned me, she said that she wanted multiple examples of femininity, and she wanted nature in the work. And there were all these aspects that she wanted me to draw on to create this piece. Anyway, I made the work. I took quite a long time to make the piece, which was good. I was so pleased she didn't mind. And I then decided that one of the aspects that I would like to reintroduce is painting. I used to paint before. So before I started this whole series of works, I was painting. I was painting more abstract works. I also started painting portraits. But now I've started to bring it back in. I'm using pastel more than I am painting, but it is something I want to explore further, because it feels as though it feels more fun to bring it back in at this point, where I've just been cutting incessantly for like 6 years. It feels good to bring that back.
And there's something about the kind of history of paint and painting and how it lasts that I think is quite interesting in your work, because you do a lot of work with archives and thinking about how these stories are retained and discovered again over time, and that so many, particularly stories of the African diaspora, have been lost or were never included in those archives in the first place.
Yeah, or hidden in archives. Yeah. Because I think there is this common feeling that our stories aren't there, or that they don't exist, and Laura's nodding, but they do. And one of the people that really introduced me to that was Serena Lee of Georgian Diaspora. She has an Instagram page. She hasn't posted on it for a while, but her research was so inspiring and so interesting, and I was able to see myself reflected back in a way in the Georgian period in a way that I'd never seen Black people represented before, and it was so exciting. So yeah.
And I think when we're thinking about kind of legacy, what's important to you about your work being retained over a long period of time? Like, is that important to you?
Yeah, it's really important. So it's not just in terms of the kinds of materials I use. So I make sure that I work on archival quality paper. I use glue that's going to last forever. And I think that doing the commission with the National Portrait Gallery, you know, the research that went into what kinds of materials I would use to ensure that these works would last was really, really important. But it's also important in terms of the work that I do with museums and the storytelling and the research and ensuring that these stories that are so often hidden are brought to the forefront. I think that's really important to me as well. But also, through what I'm doing, I'm hoping that I'm able to change the way we've been hidden. I want us to be at the forefront, so I really want to work to ensure that my work goes into institutions as well as private collections. I think it's, you know, for longevity, it's great to sell to private collectors, yes, it obviously pays the studio rent and everything else and helps me to keep my practice going, but it's also important that it ends up in spaces where the work can last and where people in years to come will be able to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's that's really important for artists to think about, you know, is that is where your work is going to be kept and seen and reused and reinterpreted, you know, because that will happen.
Yeah, and also, even if it does go into a private collection, ensuring that I have access for future shows, so that, yes, that piece that I did that took forever, that then goes into an exhibition in time, you know, in future.
What are you working on now, Sharon?
Oh, gosh. It's been a really busy start to the year. So I've just finished some new pieces for the photography show, APAD, in New York. It'll be the first time that I'm showing overseas, and I'm really stupidly excited right now. But I've just finished those works, and I'm also working on works for my solo show, which opens on the 10th of July. Please come at Hacklebury Fine Art, Launceston Place. So yeah, I'm working on those works, but I'm also working on pieces for Miami, Art Basel, and Paris as well.
And are you playing with scale? Are you playing with format? You're experimenting with how you're approaching portraiture? Yeah, so I think the piece that I'm really excited about is a large-scale paper cutout portrait of a woman in a window that I've just finished, and it's at the Framers currently. And so I'm really excited about that work because it's the most fragile work that I've created to date. It's so fragile, it's a little bit ridiculous, but I love that. I'm excited about that kind of work. I'm excited about where that takes me, how fragile, how big can I make the works, but also there are some really tiny pieces. I'll just show you this last one before we run out of time. So there are some really tiny pieces, and I've just blown it up so you can see, but it literally sits in the palm of my hand. And this is another image that my daughter had taken of me, where I'd removed the face. And it wasn't intentional to remove the face, but just looking at the fragility and the lightness of the piece. Yeah, that's what I'm working on at the moment. Well, thank you, Sharon. I'd love everyone to just join me in a round of applause and thank Sharon for being so generous. Thank you. Thank you.